The notion that the human body is complex is well granted. But what best explains the complexity in the body? Is design a good explanation of the data at hand? Well, stay tuned for this exciting dive. Welcome back to SAFT podcast, and you know the drill. If this is your first time watching or listening the podcast, then stay subscribed to be updated on all of our upcoming videos and content. And we have some very exciting content rolling out for you in the near future. So stick around. And today I am joined by a very good friend of mine and also of SAFT Apologetics, Dr. Fazale Rana. Fuz, welcome for the very first time to SAFT podcast.
Jacob, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be with you.
So let me just give you a quick introduction to who the amazing man who is here with us. Fazale Rana is the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. And I'm given to know that you've been at RTB for more than 2 decades. Is that right, Fuz?
Yes, 22 years.
And he's also the author of multiple groundbreaking books, such as Who Was Adam?, Creating Life in the Lab, The Cell's Design, and Humans 2.0. He also a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University. He was also the speaker at our inaugural Areopagus conference on the second day, and he spoke on the theme of the modern scientific evidence for God. I'll be dropping a link in the description to the sessions and the Q&A recordings, which was an absolute hoot and a half. And first, you were the only speaker at the conference who hadn't been featured on the podcast yet. So we were very excited back then to bring you on the podcast, and here we are. We're very happy that we could make it happen.
Yeah, well, I was beginning to feel left out.
So the topic that we're going to look at today, now it's something that is right up your alley, but there's a lot to cover. There's a lot of discussion that goes on in the field. There's a lot of hidden assumptions when we get into this topic. So first of all, let me just try and clear the air a bit. When the idea that the human body is complex and that this complexity requires an explanation, is that held universally by scientists, or are there scientists who think that the body is not as complex as we might grant it to be, or that this complexity does not require an explanation?
Yeah, I like to think of the concepts of complexity and design as really being kind of interacting in related concepts. And I can tell you this, regardless of one's worldview, almost everybody that looks at biological systems in general, whether it's the cell or complex organisms, including human beings, grants that biological systems are not only complex, but they also have the appearance of design. And so the ultimate question really is, how do we account for that appearance of design?
Right. And just for the sake of the podcast, it's sort of like a statutory warning. Throughout the podcast, we're going to distinguish between intelligent design theories and evolutionary theories. And what I mean by that is theories that allow for supernatural intervention from God. So those would be like intelligent design, theistic evolution, evolutionary creation. And then on the other side would be purely naturalistic evolutionary theorists who say that there is no supernatural intervention, no nothing, pure chance. So that's what I mean when we and first we talk about intelligent design theories and evolutionary theories. So that is a distinction. And I think that's very important given the way how many people try and work to reconcile intelligent design and evolutionary theoretical models. Now, one major thing that stands out when we talk about design in the human body is the term perfect design. So does the scientific world and does the scientific community use terms like perfect design when talking to or referring to complex structures? And if they do use it, do they use it in the way that we common lay people use it?
Yeah, I mean, most people that would ascribe to evolutionary theory in the way that you've defined it, where it's strictly materialistic or naturalistic, would acknowledge that biological systems have the appearance of design, but instead of that design being teleological, they argue that it's teleonomic, meaning that the design is the product of evolutionary processes. And this is really kind of a continuation of the Darwinian revolution. What Darwin did when he proposed this theory of evolution was strip design and teleology and purpose out of biology, where he argued that mind is really to be replaced by mechanism, where everything in biology could be explained through mechanistic, materialistic processes. And so even though you might see the word design used by biologists, rarely do they mean that design is perfect. Rather, they argue that design is, again, produced through evolutionary processes, which they see as being historically contingent, meaning it's predicated on a sequence of chance random events that constrain the evolutionary process. And so if you could rewind the tape of life and re-evolve life, the outcome would be different every time. It's unguided, it's without direction. And because the process is constrained by its evolutionary history, the argument is that that the best evolution can do is take existing designs, co-opt them and modify them, cobble them together with other biological systems to create new designs. So you would not expect biological designs to be perfect, but rather flawed or suboptimal designs that are limited and again, maybe even peculiar and odd in their nature because of the constraints of the evolutionary process.
Right. And given the way they define these naturalistic evolutionary theories, it's no surprise that they would use it in suboptimal terms. But when you and the teammates at RTB look at the terms of perfect and good, you don't mean it to take as to mean to lack nothing. You don't give it that meaning to it. And I'm given to understand that the reason because of that is the way you look at Genesis 1, what Genesis 1 points out to you and how the Bible presents design. Can you expand that a bit on that, on why you would take to mean it differently?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point on your part to connect this conversation about what do we mean by design and biology to the Genesis 1 account, because after each day of creation, God pronounces his work as being good and finally summarizes that the totality of creation is very good. And that word in the original Hebrew is tov, which doesn't mean perfection, but rather means that what's produced is a quality design, but it's well suited for its intended purposes and that it fits into the rest of the creation as it's intended. It's playing its particular role. And so that gives you some freedom, I think, to see designs in biology as being maybe even suboptimal at points if that suboptimality is serving the purpose of achieving an overall optimal performance.
Yeah, and I think that point, that the philosophical point that underlines there, connects when we look at, for example, the question of problem of evil. Like, why does these things happen? Because they not be the exact thing that we may anticipate. They not be the perfect outcome, but these serve into a bigger picture. They want to bring out a bigger goal. So pointing out that was quite important in this discussion. And so I just want to look at two design flaws that are put out there, quite popular ones. And when I was looking at these design flaws and I was looking at these design complexities out there were like huge gap, like huge quality gap, because one is like so complex to explain away, and the other one seems pretty typical common objections to the design. And so the first one that I found on the article on the site Nautilus, it says that the pelvis of a woman hasn't changed in the past 200,000 years, which they say is adding insult to injury to the pain of childbirth. And as soon as I read this, my mind immediately just went to Genesis, because we see the passage where God says he's going to increase the pain of childbearing and not introduce it for the first time, but rather increase it. What is your response when you heard this particular design flow, and what is the connection we see in Genesis?
Yeah, and the process of human pregnancy is oftentimes highlighted by people that would argue that the human body has flawed designs and is therefore the product of evolution. And as you pointed out, the female pelvis is chief among those features that are highlighted. And in fact, this takes on a little bit of a personal note for me, because yesterday my oldest daughter gave birth to her first son and our 10th grandchild. So, but she had some difficulties with her pregnancy, and so they had to induce her labor early, for her health and for the health of the baby. And yet, in spite of these complications that happen, really, when you look at human pregnancy, it's an incredibly elegant system that isn't necessarily poorly designed, but rather is confronted with trade-offs. Many times when we see systems that people declare to be poorly designed, these are systems that are trying to accomplish multiple objectives. And many times those objectives are competing with one another.
Right.
And so anybody that knows anything about engineering knows that in order to produce an overall optimal system, you have to sometimes intentionally sub-optimize aspects of the system in order to serve that intended purpose. And so when it comes to human beings, what characterizes us in terms of our anatomy is our very large brain. We have the largest brain size to body ratio of any organism that exists. And so that large brain puts, demands on the birthing process. And because human beings stand erect, and our pelvis is of the similar design of organisms that walk on four legs, in order to be able to accommodate bipedalism, you have to basically narrow the pelvis, and that leads to a more narrow birth canal. But there are compensating mechanisms in place. For example, most of brain development in humans takes place outside of the womb. So at the time of birth, only 25% of our brain has been fully grown and developed. Also, in our skull, we have these plates at the time of birth that are connected by soft tissue that can slide past each other, allowing the large human head to make it through that narrow birth canal. And so what I look at is really, this is being, which is known as the obstetric dilemma, is that it's really balancing two competing objectives. One is to produce human beings with very large brain sizes, but also to be able to accommodate a birthing process. And so the trade-off is essentially, again, that there is pain in childbirth, that it can be a difficult process, but the body is designed in such a way to allow for that birthing to take place and allow for human beings at the same time to have a very large head. And interestingly enough, a few years ago, there was a study done that actually showed there was a genetic link between brain size and the size of the birth canal in women. That the genes that controlled the size of the birth canal also controlled brain size or head size. And so women that had larger heads, who most likely would have children with larger heads, also had larger openings in their pelvis. So there's a genetic link between, again, those two sets of genes, so that if brain size increases, pelvis opening, the opening increases as well. So there are these compensatory mechanisms. So instead of seeing this as a flawed design, I see it as an elegant example of a trade-off that allows human beings to reproduce and produce, our chief feature, which is our large brain size.
Wow. I mean, when I was looking at this example, this is like brand new information, especially about the genes, like this mind-blowing stuff. So when I looked at the other example as well, I felt that this first one was going to be much more easier to deal with. But the second one, I think I'm really looking forward to see what, as a biochemist, as a Christian apology, your response is going to be, because the second one is very, it's straight up our sleeves as common people, because we would look at them, we would go, that one makes sense. So the second design flaw that I noted is the objection of the male nipple, because unlike the female counterpart, it serves no purpose. There is nothing there to it. And so people would look at that and say, oh, that is a simple but a very profound objection to intelligent design, because it makes absolute sense. If humans, we evolved, and male, female, we dissected somewhere down the evolutionary line to have that sort of a reminder that this broken human part. So what is your response going to be for that?
Yeah, and first of all, I think it's appropriate to challenge the notion that male nipples serve no function. And we're all adults here, but male nipples actually are conserved for sexual stimulation. So to say that they don't have function actually isn't technically correct. But let's just grant the objection for a moment. And the way I like to think about this, and let me just step back and lay out a principle here. And this actually applies to the whole issue even of the human pelvis, because there are some evolutionary biologists who would argue, look, if a creator was involved, why wouldn't he design human beings with a completely different blueprint so that we could walk erect without having, again, these constraints on our on the pelvis that leads to things like the obstetric dilemma. And one of the principles that you see prior to Darwin that biologists were working with is this idea of archetypes. That is, they argued that the shared biological features that we see in organisms doesn't reflect an evolutionary history, but rather reflects an archetypical design that exists in the mind of God that then is functionally manifested in the created order.
Right.
And so they argued that it's remarkable to think that you could take the archetype that exists in the invertebrate anatomy, and it's so versatile that it could be modified to create organisms with a wide range of functional diversity. So people like Sir Richard Owen saw this as the quintessential example of design.
Right.
And so the question would be, well, why wouldn't God, create differently? Well, this archetype, again, is an elegant way to design, but also it makes biology actually possible as a scientific discipline because of the shared designs that organisms have. It means if we study one organism, that knowledge is generalized across a big swath of biology. And so the archetype design not only is an elegant way to create, but it also allows for again, discoverability. It means that biology is designed to be discoverable. So now let's go and apply this to human reproduction or an embryological development, because it's not just simply anatomical and physiological features, I believe, that show archetypical designs, but it's also biological processes like embryological development. And so it's really interesting to note that when we look at different organisms that are vertebrates, the embryological development is very similar at different points in the developmental process, and then it bifurcates in different directions to produce different organisms. But what an elegant way to design reproduction is that there's not individual embryological developmental processes, but a single process that can then be varied to produce a wide range of organisms. But that allows to retain, again, core biological features. So in other words, you can't really have biological archetypes if you don't have some kind of archetype manifested in the embryological development process as well, if that makes any sense. And so, but it also means that, again, embryology is designed to be discoverable, that it means that embryology is possible as a scientific discipline. So now when it comes to human embryological development, I don't know that many people realize this, but for the first 6 weeks of our lives as embryos, we all are female, right? That's the default position. And then about 6 weeks into the developmental process, there are genes that are activated on the Y chromosome that initiate developmental programs that make that female embryo male, if, again, a Y chromosome is present. So now you can begin to see what's going on here is that there is a core developmental program that then can be modified to produce male and female individuals. And as a result of that, I would argue that male nipples are simply a consequence of that developmental regime. So even if they don't serve, quote unquote, a function, it's not reflecting an elegant design necessarily, but rather a constraint on having a core developmental process that is then varied to produce, human beings of, male and female genders.
Wow. I did not anticipate that sort of a proper response coming. And the point about embryology was, wow, I've never heard about that bit about of leading up to 6 weeks and chromosomes activating in it. And you're not in between. Like, I don't know if people realize this. First, let me tell you, I don't realize most of the things until you say it, and I go, wow, is that really the case? So if, to the audience, if you're thinking that this is like way beyond your pay grade, what you're hearing, will join the club. And that's one more reason that you need to get hold of first amazing books out there. Maybe just a note about the Bible says that, that every man comes from a woman. I know it talks directly to the creation of Adam and Eve, but when you mentioned about the embryology, the 6 week bit, it just stuck to me that I'm not saying that the Bible refers to that. I'm not saying the Bible refers to that embryology, but I could see some sort of a connection there. We don't have time to explore that, but maybe something that we can explore sometime later.
Yeah. And I know that my answers may be a little bit more detailed than people might like, but the point I'm trying to make is that a design framework is robust, is theoretically robust, that there's a rationale for why we see the features that we see in biological systems, that these are not ad hoc explanations that are designed to respond to objections, but there's a theoretical framework that's rich and robust that undergirds kind of a design framework. That's really hopefully the larger point that I think I would want people to walk away with.
Yeah. And one thing I realized in my course, and this is just for the audience, that when you listen to podcasts and stuff, you're going to come across a lot of new information. And some of us might be more inclined to read than listen. So don't feel bad about skipping back 10 seconds to capture the point again. That's normal. That's how everyone listen to podcasts and everyone listen to videos. So make that a habit, so the point that you don't get through a video, you don't get through an episode, but you pick up all the information out there. And first, I came across Nathan H. Lentz. So he's the author of the book Human Errors. And in an interview, he noted that humans are not perfect because evolution didn't have to be invoked to adapt to survive hostile environments, because we built houses, we built clothes. And so we found these shortcuts to overcome the challenges. And so we didn't have those challenges stay that way. So therefore, we didn't have to invoke evolution. So that's what his point is there. And it seemed to be a pretty interesting explanation from an evolutionary standpoint to that notion of why we have these flaws. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, well, this connects back to an earlier question you asked me about the narrow female pelvis and the pain in childbirth. Because again, the obstetric dilemma is a dilemma because human beings have a very large brain size. We have the largest brain size to body mass ratio of any organism that exists. And that large brain size that we have gives us a unique capacity, which is our ability to represent the world with symbols. And so we're the only creature that has the symbolism, where not only can we represent concrete aspects of the world around us with symbols, we also represent abstract ideas with symbols. But moreover, we can manipulate those symbols in our minds, combine them or recombine them, nest them one within another to create these alternative scenarios, these alternative hypotheses about the world that we are part of. And this ability is manifested in the form of open-ended generative language that we possess. Animals communicate, but only human beings have this open-ended language, and on top of that, it's also manifested in the form of music and art and things like that. But it's our capacity for symbolism that makes possible the development of science, or even prior to the development of modern science, what you might want to call maybe proto-science, where we were able to develop an understanding of the world around us, and then out of that understanding develop technology that allowed human beings to literally migrate to all different parts of the world and thrive in very harsh environments. And so what Nathan Lentz sees as this evidence for evolution, I see as very powerful evidence, not only for design, but for the biblical account of human nature, in that our ability to express ideas symbolically, I believe, is a manifestation of the image of God. And so think about this: human beings, first appear in, really sub-Saharan Africa, in that part of the world, in a relatively, benign environment where there's an abundance of resources. And yet we very quickly developed the wherewithal to produce the technology that allowed us to become the dominant species on the planet. And ironically, we are now have such a knowledge and understanding of biology that we are in a position where people are looking at using technology to essentially take control of our own evolution, evolving post-human species, or through synthetic biology, evolving novel, non-natural life forms that could serve as a type of technology for us. And so we are the only creature that not only, has developed this kind of sophisticated technology, but has actually is now looking at, in a sense, taking control of evolution. And so, yes, indeed, we didn't, there may be quote unquote flaws in our body, but those flaws, or those, and I would rather say limitations rather than flaws, those limitations are far more overcome and compensated by our very large brain size, so that no longer are we predator or prey for predators, but that we can hunt and ward off even the most ferocious predator. And it's because of our large brain size and our cognitive capacity. So I see Nathan Lentz's point as actually really paving the way to make a larger point about the truth of Christianity.
Right. Yeah. And just to note to the audience, talking about how our bodies design, all of that, you need to take a look at the video that came on the BBC channel called The Perfect Human Body, where they created this body that has these different features that they thought would adapt and make us better human bodies. I mean, it's a nightmare thing. You may get nightmares at night seeing that the synthetic body that was created with weird features and stuff, but that makes us think that we are so much better off in the way we are. And so now getting into the topic of the point of the actual points of complexity and actual points of design in the human body, irreducible complexity, and that's ID proponents say that this is one of the smoking guns for intelligent design. What is so special about the notion of irreducible complexity?
Yeah, well, I have even though I'm very much a design proponent, I kind of have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the concept of irreducible complexity. It's true that systems that are the product of human designers many times are irreducibly complex. And what's meant by that is that the system is composed of a number of parts that interact in a precise way to accomplish a purpose. And that if any one of those parts is missing, or even if any one of those parts doesn't interact in a precise way, then that system no longer functions. It ceases to function. And so we produce irreducibly complex systems all the time. And biological systems, and particularly biochemical systems, are indeed irreducibly complex. And so that in and of itself is a suggestion, or at least suggestive, that these systems are designed or the work of a mind. Now, many ID proponents go one step further, and they argue that irreducibly complex systems cannot be produced through an evolutionary process, through a stepwise evolutionary process. And the argument is that if you, through evolution, where you're assembling a complex system in a stepwise manner, those intermediate systems aren't going to have any kind of function because they're incomplete, and therefore natural selection has nothing to operate on and can't select these intermediate designs. That evolution would go nowhere. And so they argue that irreducible complexity is, again, evidence that evolution can't produce these systems, therefore they must be the product of a designer, they must be the work of a mind. That's the argument. The difficulty with that argument is that evolutionary biologists have proposed ways in which irreducibly complex systems could emerge, and it's through a process called co-option, where you have pre-existing systems that are carrying out functions that are distinct from the final system, and that those pre-existing systems can then be co-opted by the evolutionary process and modified to produce another intermediary system that has a different function. And eventually you can wind up producing that system that you interpret as being irreducibly complex, but it actually has this evolutionary history that is characterized by co-option. And so, I think irreducible complexity is a fine quality to use as you make a case for design, but I don't think it's the smoking gun that many people claim it to be, because if you frame the argument this way, evolution can't produce irreducibly complex systems, they must be the product of a mind. Biochemistry is an irreducibly complex system, therefore it must be the product of a mind. And then an evolutionary biologist comes along and says, well, here's a mechanism, it's co-option. The whole argument and the whole case for design unravels. And so you just have to be aware of it, that is a limitation of that concept. I don't see it as a smoking gun, but I do see irreducible complexity as a helpful concept that at least is suggestive of design, but it doesn't rule out other explanations necessarily.
I think the prudent way to approach it would be to say that it's more probable, given irreducible complexity, that this could be the result of design than evolution. I think that would be a much more prudent way to look at it. And
well, and you also have the issue of burden of proof, because if you now, as an evolutionary biologist, are going to say co-option can produce these kind of systems, then they're obligated to show us mechanistically how that happens, not just in a general sense, but specifically for the system that we're focused on. So you can shift the burden of proof, I think, legitimately, to say, okay, then show me how. It's one thing to say, in general terms, this is how it could happen, but you have to show specifically how it happened in each of these cases for, the argument to be completely undermined.
Right. And the other point of intelligent design, the complexity in the body that you displayed at the conference, that was just superb. And one of my friends who's doing postdoc research, he later recalled to me that point of the ATP-Synthase, we'll just talk about in a minute, was right up his sleeve, and it was right up his alley. And he was so excited to see someone point that and talk about it and point towards the intelligent design. What makes ATP-Synthase one of your favorite presentations to talk about the complexity in the human body?
Yeah, well, what I like about that protein is, number one, it's ubiquitous. It's found everywhere in biology. It's found in bacteria and archaea. It's also found in eukaryotic organisms. And it serves a very critical role. It essentially produces ATP, which is the fuel molecule used by cells to power their operations. And so it's ubiquitous, and you could make the case that it's perhaps one of the most important enzyme complexes that exist in nature because of its central role in energy harvesting. Interestingly enough, this complex has an architecture and an operation that is eerie in terms of its similarity to a man-made rotary motor. It's literally an electrically powered rotary motor that operates at near 100% efficiency, that turns electrical chemical potential into mechanical energy that then is used to generate molecules that store chemical energy. So it's this incredibly elegant system, and that the more that we learn about it, the more elegant, the more remarkable it becomes. But it literally is made up of a motor that turns a rotor that has a cam that interacts with turbines. It has a stator. It literally is a machine in every sense of the word.
And the purpose that it comes to fulfill, and this is just stepping to the next point, it's like you said, and I think, and I've seen that natural scientists, like naturalistic evolution scientists, also use the terminology and bring that analogy between that of the ATP-Synthase and a mechanical motor. And that's a pretty stark admission to make in the first place. But the thing that stood out to me when looking at all these examples of complexity in the design is looking from the sense of species adapting to the environment, and from the cells mutating all the way and be getting huge species like the whales, is how do we explain the conception of the identification of a particular cellular need? Like how does someone who is holding onto a purely naturalistic evolutionary theory explain that at a particular stage, this particular species decided to create ATP-Synthase, to create the structure within it? How do they come to explain that? Not the mere adaptation. People like to throw that general term and say, what will be adapted? But the very point that at the cellular level, the species identify that there is need for ribosomes or ATP-Synthase to meet this particular need, and that it would later interact with this particular oxygen or carbon dioxide in the environment, and then it would use that energy to create vitamin C in the body. And all of these very minute intricacies, like you said, the dilemma of the pelvis and the size of the brain. How do naturalistic evolution theories come to explain all of those? And just to push the point a bit ahead, it's different to say that we humans decided to, or birds wanted to fly and they tried to jump over hills, like Richard Dawkins says, and they eventually caught air. And it's a different thing to say when you have a full-grown species that reacts to the environment, thinks about in those macro sense. But in this very micro sense, how do naturalistic evolutionary theories come to explain the formation of these cellular functions?
Well, in this, you're asking a really, really important and insightful question, because when it comes to something like ATP synthase, which we just talked about, as I mentioned, it's ubiquitous in biology, which means that it's most likely, from an evolutionary perspective, would have been present in what's called the last universal common answer, this very first cell that anchors the evolutionary tree of life. In fact, it may even have been present prior, and again, in evolutionary terms, prior to the emergence of LUCA. Well, the same thing is true for basically the core biochemical systems that are necessary for life to exist. DNA replication, the process of protein synthesis, which includes transcription and translation. It also would involve the formation of cell membranes and cell walls, as well as energy harvesting pathways. These are considered to be the core biochemical systems, and they most certainly were already intact, in place, with the last universal common answer, right, because these features are universal to living systems. Now, this is where the problem arises, is because what we're learning about the cell is that in its minimal form, it is still so complex that it's beyond imagination how a system like that could emerge all at once. We talked about the idea of irreducible complexity. Well, cells themselves are irreducibly complex in that you've got to have certain core biochemical systems in place, and they have to interact. And each of those core systems is in turn made up of an ensemble of irreducibly complex systems. So you have kind of a hierarchy of irreducible complexity from individual systems that then are integrated and then are in turn integrated into forming a minimal cell. Now, then we couple that recognition with the fact that we have really good evidence that life appeared on Earth as far back as 3.8 billion years ago, maybe even earlier than that. And that the very first cells that appear on Earth are incredibly complex biochemically speaking. They are as complex as we imagine the minimum complexity for LUCA, maybe even more complex than that. Well, the problem is that once you push life's origin back to 3.8 billion years, you're leaving very little time for an origin of life process, because it's unlikely that the Earth could have sustained any type of chemical evolution prior to 4 billion years ago.
Right.
And so you have an extremely narrow window of time for chemical evolution to happen. We see that the very first life forms appear to be biochemically complex, even though they're single-celled organisms. LUCA looks as if it's incredibly complex. Life's minimal complexity is very complex, and it's irreducibly complex. And so you've got this convergence of observations that really say there's no time available for evolution to produce these kind of systems, assuming there would be pathways to produce them. And so when it comes to the complexity of biochemistry, you don't have the time for it to evolve. That's I think the crux of the response is you just don't have time for it to evolve.
Right, and I think that strikes right into the point where in the scientific world we haven't really got a theory that explains the origin of life. There is different forms of Darwinian mechanism, modern synthesis, extended evolution synthesis that all try to explain how we evolved later on, but the field of origin of life is still quite pretty blank in trying to explain it. And as we come to the conclusion of this wonderful podcast, we looked at the flaws that are there, like you said, these limitations and these amazing insights of complex design. Now, this question actually makes, looking back at how we have explained all of this, I think this question makes more sense in sort of a cosmic sense, talking about the fine-tuning of the universe and different parts. But in the human sense, if someone were to weigh on a scale, on one side the limitations or the flaws of the human body, and on the other side the complexities, what do you think is going to be the result, and how much is one going to win over the other?
Well, that essentially in that weight in the balance, I guess, the weighing process and the balance is really very important, because in his famous essay, The Panda's Thumb, written by the late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, he literally argues that elegant designs in biology really can't be used to make a case for evolution, because that's what you would expect a creator to do. But he argues that the scale tips in favor of evolution because of the bad designs or the flawed designs. And it's for that reason that I devoted an entire chapter to discussing the bad design argument, or the counter argument to the design argument, in my book, The Cell's Design, because that represents, I think, the greatest challenge to the design argument, or so-called bad designs. And we need to be able to develop a response to them. And in the bottom line is that there are two concepts that, again, we've already talked about today, but let's just kind of, codify them. One is that many times what we think to be bad designs are very complex systems that are poorly understood, and that the more that we learn about the systems, the more that we realize they have to be that way. There's a rationale, and if they were different, they wouldn't be good systems, good designs. And so bad designs turn into good designs many times with added knowledge, or to recognize that maybe the system is complex and it's trying to accomplish multiple objectives that are competing. And so what we see as a bad design is really reflecting a trade-off that's necessary, and it's not truly speaking a bad design. So to me, I think when you factor in the response that we can bring to the table, for so-called bad designs, I think that actually forces the direction towards the work of a creator, or towards the good designs. And if they're good designs, then it makes sense to think that there's a good designer.
I think the key point is that once the point you mentioned about how we dig into these limitations of flow, and we see that there's more to it than what meets the eye. And also when we try and weigh the complexity, it's too complex. That's what I noticed. It's not merely 5 complex designs against 10 flow designs. It's even if it's 5, they're like too complex to explain. And I think maybe Stephen Jay Gould has that point there. I think that's something where he merits credit. And we've come to the very final end, and maybe we have 2 minutes left. And this is this fan favorite question that I have got to ask you. You already know what I'm going to ask you. The video clips are out there. The newspapers are out there. It's all there that there is something going on in space. There's something that US Navy pilots are coming across. UFO sightings, what are they? There's still explanation going on around there. But it has actually, if it has done anything, it's that theory that there is extraterrestrial life has gained more traction. It's gained more attention. It's becoming more and more closer to being a public view. And as a biochemist who advanced the Christian view that life on Earth is special, that we humans are special, and speaking about the fine-tuning of the universe and the Earth, what do you think would be your response to if we come to realize that there is extraterrestrial life?
Yeah, well, I think the first point I would make is that there's nothing in Christian theology that makes it impossible to think that there could very well be extraterrestrial life. If we think about God as a creator, then there's no reason to think that God would limit his creative work to the
right.
Earth, that he could very well have created, other places throughout the universe. And so, if we discover life elsewhere, it doesn't necessarily mean it undermines a design, the case for design, or anything like that. So, I don't think that the design argument is intrinsically threatened by the discovery of extraterrestrial life, and the fact that there's credibility that's suddenly being granted to many of these UFO sightings is really intriguing. And there's a great book that I would commend to your audience, and it's called Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. And it's a Christian perspective on the UFO phenomena. And it's co-authored by Hugh Ross, Ken Samples, and Mark Clark. And of course, Hugh Ross is an astronomer, Ken Samples is a philosopher, and then Mark Clark is a political scientist who, and they come together to address the whole UFO phenomena. But what they conclude is that most UFO events are either some kind of natural process that people mistake as being an aircraft, or they may be experimental aircrafts or things like that people, again, are observing. But they note that there seems to be a residual number of UFO sightings that don't find explanation in those two categories. But when you examine the details of what these different phenomena entail, they oftentimes are defying the laws of physics. And so their point is that this could very well be pointing to the fact that these are real events, but they may be spiritual in nature. And in fact, they show that there seems to be a connection between demonology and between the UFO phenomena, particularly when people have encounters with these residual UFOs. And so they argue that this is essentially what we're looking at is essentially a spiritual phenomena. So it's a very interesting hypothesis they propose that does a great job of, I think, accounting for the facts, recognizing again, the fact that as Christians we realize there is a reality beyond the physical material world, and could these UFO phenomena really be a manifestation of demonic activity of sorts?
Wow, that is very interesting. And once again, I'll be dropping the link in the description to the books, all mentioned in the podcast. And just to give an overview of what we've looked at so far is that what I saw immediately stand up is in the Christian perspective, in the Christian worldview, the notions of design and these points of limitations, they get much more meaning because we're looking at a God who's not simply creating mere species of life on earth and then leaving us as we are, but there's much more that goes behind it. There's much more that goes into it. The decisions that we make, the fall, the sin of mankind, and the actions that contribute towards it, they all connect into how we are created on earth. And the point you said in the beginning about God looking at things and calling it good, they are there to meet a particular criteria, meet a particular goal, and those are best explained when we look at through the lens of the gospel and of the Bible. And so once again, thank you, Fuz, for joining us on SAFT podcast. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
My pleasure to join you. Thank you.
And once again, our audience, thank you for joining us, and we will catch you in the next one. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.